The door was already open when I stepped inside, and that should have been my first warning. The house sounded wrong. Too loud. Too full. Voices layered over each other, chairs scraping against tile, someone laughing a little too hard. For a second, I honestly thought I'd walked into the wrong place. Same address. Same familiar entryway table with the chipped corner. But the living room had been transformed. Folding chairs lined the walls. 2 borrowed tables were pushed together down the center, covered in a white cloth that didn't quite hide the stains underneath. 33 people turned their heads at once. Not in surprise. Not warmly. Just assessing. Like I'd interrupted something. No one said my name. I stood there with my bag still on my shoulder, waiting for the moment someone would smile, or ask if I'd eaten, or at least tell me where to sit. Instead, conversations restarted almost immediately. A few nods. One tight smile from a cousin I barely recognized. Then nothing. I should have left. I told myself that as I scanned the room and realized there was exactly one empty chair, all the way at the far end of the table. I walked to it slowly, the way you do when you don't want to draw attention, even though every step felt loud. I sat down. The chair wobbled. Plates were already being passed. Someone reached right past me to hand one to the person beside me. No one asked if I wanted one. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at the tablecloth while they talked about promotions, engagements, pregnancies. Names I wasn't part of. Stories I hadn't been invited into. It felt intentional. That was the part one couldn't ignore. Then my mother stood up. She didn't tap a glass or ask for attention. She just rose from her chair and walked to the wall behind her, where the family photos were arranged in neat rows. Christmas cards. Graduations. Group shots where everyone leaned in close, smiling like nothing could ever touch us. She reached for the first frame. I didn't understand what she was doing until the picture came off the wall. Then another. And another. Each one with my face in it. She stacked them in her arms like they were nothing, glass clinking softly with each movement. The room went quiet. Forks paused midair. She crossed the room and dropped the frames into the trash can beside the table. They don't belong up anymore, she said, her voice steady. Loud enough for everyone to hear. She's a leech. Always has been. No one laughed. No one stopped her. My father didn't even look surprised. He leaned back in his chair, eyes on me, and said, "You should pay us back, you know. For everything we wasted raising you." Across the table, my sister pushed her chair back and stood. She didn't touch me. She just pointed toward the door, the way employees do when they're escorting someone out. I picked up my bag. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I walked past the table, past the trash can with my face in it, and out the front door without saying a word. Behind me, the house filled with noise again. And as I stood on the porch waiting for my ride, one thought settled in with absolute clarity. This dinner was never about family. The air outside felt cooler than it should have, like my body hadn't caught up to what had just happened yet. I stood on the porch and stared at my phone, watching the rideshare icon crawl closer. Through the front window, I could see silhouettes moving again, forks clinking, laughter returning. Whatever scene they'd staged for me was over. I'd played my role. Now the show could continue. When the car pulled up, I didn't look back. The driver asked how my night was going. I said, "Fine," and meant it in a way that surprised me. Not because it was true, but because something had gone quiet inside me. The part that still hoped they might stop, apologize, chase me down the driveway, that part finally went still. My apartment was dark when I got home. I dropped my bag by the door, kicked my shoes off, and stood there for a second, listening to the hum of the fridge. No voices. No audience. Just me. That's when my hands started shaking. Not from embarrassment. From clarity. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and didn't even sit down at first. The screen lit up the room, harsh and white. I opened a blank document and typed a single sentence at the top, all caps so I couldn't pretend later that I'd misunderstood my own intention. This is not about feelings. I stared at it until my breathing slowed. Then I added another line. This is about my name. Because that was the thing they never said out loud at the dinner, but had been circling for years. The reason my credit alerts came at strange hours. The reason collection letters showed up for accounts I didn't recognize. The reason my mother always insisted on helping with paperwork, just to make sure everything's clean. I thought about my mom, Diane. Senior loan officer. The kind of woman who corrected waiters on how to split a bill. Who talked about credit scores like they were moral character tests. My dad, Gerald. Co-owner of a heating and air company. Proud of his hustle. Proud of reminding me how much it cost to raise me, like childhood was a loan accruing interest. My sister, Lauren. The one with the soft voice and the job that looked good on brochures. The one who'd offered to manage things for me when I moved out, said it would be easier if everything stayed in the family. I sat down and started a list. Dates. Accounts. Addresses. Every moment that had felt off but easy to dismiss at the time. I didn't rush. I didn't cry over it. I treated it like inventory. Halfway through, I realized something that made my chest tighten. They hadn't just decided tonight that I didn't belong. Tonight was confirmation. Not the beginning. And as I scrolled through old emails and bank statements, a quiet question settled in my mind, one I didn't answer yet. If they were so comfortable erasing me in public, what had they already done to me in private? I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was replaying what they'd said, but because every new detail I uncovered made it harder to stop. Once you start looking at your life like a paper trail instead of a memory, things rearrange themselves fast. There it was. An old utility account opened when I was 19. My name. My social. An address I'd never lived at. Closed after months of late payments. Then another, store credit. Then a personal loan inquiry I didn't remember authorizing, tied to my parents' home address. I felt cold, even though the apartment was warm. I kept going. I pulled credit reports from all three bureaus, hand steady, jaw clenched. Each page felt heavier than the last. It wasn't catastrophic. Not yet. That was the clever part. Small amounts. Just enough to float them when cash was tight. Just enough to normalize the damage so I'd always feel slightly behind, slightly irresponsible. Just enough that I'd keep blaming myself. Around 4 a.m, I pushed my chair back and stood up. The sun hadn't come up yet, but the sky was starting to thin. I walked to the bathroom and looked at my face in the mirror. I didn't look shocked. I looked finished. There are moments when anger burns hot and reckless. This wasn't that. This was the colder kind. The kind that organizes itself. I went back to the table and opened a new folder. I named it personal. Inside, I saved copies of everything. Statements. Credit pulls. Emails where my mom had helpfully forwarded documents for me to sign, insisting it was easier if she handled it. At some point, I realized I was smiling. Not because any of this was good, but because for the first time, the story made sense. The dinner wasn't about humiliating me. That was just the surface. It was about control. About reminding me that they thought they still owned me. That I was indebted. That I should feel lucky to be tolerated. By noon the next day, I was sitting across from a legal aid attorney in a small office that smelled like old coffee and printer toner. I didn't dramatize anything. I slid my laptop across the desk and said, "I think my family used my identity." She didn't gasp. She didn't look shocked. She just adjusted her glasses and said, "Let's take a look." As she scrolled, her expression changed. Not outrage. Recognition. "This isn't accidental," she said quietly. "And it isn't isolated." I nodded. "I know." She leaned back in her chair. You have options. But once you start, you can't undo it. I thought about my mother dropping my photos into the trash. About my father calling me an investment. About my sister pointing at the door like I was something to be removed. I'm not trying to punish anyone, I said. And I meant it. I just want my name back. The attorney closed the laptop and met my eyes. Then we'll do this properly. As I walked out of the building later that afternoon, phone buzzing with a group text I didn't open, one thought stayed with me. They thought erasing me would make things simpler. They had no idea how complicated it was about to become. The first letter arrived 3 weeks later. Not to me. To my parents' house. That was intentional. I knew because my mother called me 7 minutes after it was delivered. I didn't answer. I watched the phone vibrate on the table while I made coffee, steam fogging up the kitchen window. When it stopped, I waited. Then came the text. We need to talk. Immediately. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my email and reread the timeline the attorney had helped me build. Dates lined up too neatly to be coincidence. The utility account opened right after my 18th birthday. The credit card opened when my dad's business had dipped. The personal loan inquiry during the months my mom kept saying things were tight but manageable. All of it under my name. All of it signed with confidence. The next call came from my sister. Then my dad. Then a message from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years asking if everything was okay, because your parents seem really stressed. That was when it clicked how quickly the story had started to move without me saying a word. I didn't post. I didn't explain. I didn't correct anyone. Silence does something interesting when people are used to controlling the narrative. It makes them panic. They start filling the gaps themselves. A week later, my attorney forwarded me copies of the responses my parents had submitted. Pages of explanations. Justifications. Statements that contradicted each other in small but important ways. My mom claimed I'd given verbal permission. My dad said he thought the accounts were joint. My sister's name appeared once, then disappeared entirely. None of them mentioned the dinner. None of them mentioned erasing me. They acted like this was a misunderstanding. A clerical thing. Something that could be smoothed over if everyone just calmed down. What they didn't understand was that this process didn't care about feelings. It cared about records. Signatures. Patterns. The investigator assigned to the case called me on a Tuesday afternoon. Her voice was calm, professional. We're going to need to interview your family, she said. Separately. I closed my eyes and nodded even though she couldn't see me. After the call, I sat at my table for a long time, thinking about how many dinners they'd hosted. How many photos they'd staged. How carefully they'd curated the image of a family that handled things internally. And I realized something else. They'd never once asked me how I was doing. Not after the dinner. Not after the letters. Not even now. Every message was about fixing this. Making it go away. Protecting themselves. That told me everything I needed to know. The next time my phone rang, I finally answered. It was my mother. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Honey, she said, like we were starting from a clean slate. You don't understand what you're doing. I looked around my apartment. At the quiet. At the life I'd built without their help. I understand exactly what I'm doing, I said calmly. I'm letting the truth speak for itself. She started to cry. Not loudly. Strategically. I didn't comfort her. Because for the first time, I wasn't the one being erased. And as I ended the call, a question settled in my chest, steady and unresolved. What happens to a family when the person they built their secrets on finally steps away? The interviews happened on different days. That mattered. I learned later that people tell cleaner lies when they believe they're the first to speak. They fill in details they assume everyone else will agree with. They don't realize those details are the very things that expose them. I wasn't present for any of it. I didn't ask to be. I didn't need to hear their voices explaining me away again. The investigator summarized instead, her notes clipped and neutral. My father spoke confidently. Too confidently. He framed everything as responsibility. Said he'd handled finances because I was unreliable in my early 20s. He claimed I'd known about everything, that I'd even thanked him once for keeping things organized. My mother went a different direction. She leaned into concern. Said she'd worried about my impulsiveness, that she'd stepped in to protect my future. She emphasized how much she'd sacrificed for me. College. Clothes. Food. As if those things came with a lifetime invoice. My sister cried. She said she'd never meant to hurt me. That she'd only followed what our parents told her. That she'd assumed everything was legal because our mom works in finance. That last sentence didn't land the way she hoped. A week after the interviews, my attorney called and asked me to come by his office. Not urgent. Just necessary. He slid a folder across the table and said, "They've opened a secondary review." For what? I asked. For pattern. He explained it simply. One fraudulent account could be explained away. 2 raised eyebrows. But multiple accounts, across years, tied to the same household, benefiting the same people? That stopped being a misunderstanding. It became a system. I left his office and walked 3 blocks before I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. That surprised me. I'd expected fear to grow the deeper this went. Instead, I felt lighter. Like I'd finally set down something heavy I'd been carrying since childhood. That night, my aunt texted again. A longer message this time. She said the family was worried. That people were confused. That my parents were having a really hard time. I typed a response. Deleted it. Typed again. Then I set the phone face down and went to bed. Because somewhere along the way, I'd learned a quiet truth most people don't realize until it's too late. You don't owe access to the people who only want you quiet. The consequences arrived slowly. My dad's business was audited. Routine, they called it. But contracts paused. Clients hesitated. His name started appearing in conversations that didn't include praise. My mother was placed on temporary leave. Not fired. Not yet. But removed from her position while internal matters were reviewed. The same woman who used to lecture me about responsibility was suddenly home on weekdays, watching daytime television, waiting for emails that didn't come. They stopped calling me after that. Not because things were resolved. But because they'd realized something worse. I wasn't going to save them. And as the silence stretched, another question took shape, quiet, unavoidable. If they'd built their entire image on control, who were they without it? The first time I ran into one of them in public, it wasn't dramatic. It was a grocery store on a Wednesday afternoon. I was standing in the produce aisle, comparing avocados, when I heard my name said softly behind me. Not confidently. Not the way it used to be said at family gatherings, like an announcement. I turned. It was my sister. She looked smaller. Not physically, emotionally. Like someone who'd been shrinking herself for weeks and hadn't noticed yet. Her hair was pulled back, no makeup, no counselor smile ready for display. "Hey," she said. "Hey," I replied. We stood there between the oranges and the apples, 2 people who shared a last name but nothing else anymore. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. I didn't know it would go this far. I nodded once. I did. That was the difference between us now. She told me our parents weren't sleeping. That my mom cried every night. That my dad barely talked at dinner. She said the family didn't feel like a family anymore. I listened without interrupting. Without reacting. When she finished, she waited. Like there was supposed to be something on my side of the conversation. Comfort. Reassurance. A promise to fix it. Instead, I said, I didn't make it go this far. I stopped making it smaller. Her eyes filled, but I didn't step closer. Because somewhere inside me, a boundary had locked into place. She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away. They want to know if you'd consider, settling. I picked up an avocado, turned it in my hand, then placed it gently into my cart. I'm not negotiating reality, I said. She didn't argue. That told me she finally understood. A month later, the official findings came through. I didn't read them all at once. I skimmed. Then I closed the document and went for a walk. It was early evening, the sky that soft blue that makes everything feel temporarily peaceful. Fraud confirmed. Misrepresentation documented. Professional ethics violations noted. Consequences followed in clean, clinical language. My mother resigned before termination. The word voluntary was used, but everyone knew what it meant. Her reputation, carefully built over decades, collapsed quietly. No public scandal. Just doors that stopped opening. My father's company lost its largest contract. Not because of the case directly, but because trust is fragile in small industries. Once people start whispering, they stop signing. And my sister? She stayed employed. But the brochures were updated. Her name removed from the front page. Her role adjusted. None of them called to tell me. I found out through other people. Through fragments. Through the way the air around their names changed. One afternoon, a letter arrived at my apartment. Not legal. Not official. Handwritten. From my mother. She wrote about love. About mistakes. About how families forgive. She said she hoped I could come back one day. I read it once. Then I folded it and placed it in a drawer. Not as evidence. As closure. Because forgiveness doesn't always mean access. And accountability doesn't always come with an apology. That night, as I sat alone in my apartment, a calm settled over me, not relief, not victory, just certainty. I hadn't destroyed my family. I'd simply stopped holding up the version of it that was never real. And with that realization came the final, quiet question. When the truth costs you everything fake, what do you finally gain that's real? The last time I saw my parents together was at a courthouse cafe. Not inside a courtroom. Not in front of a judge. Just sitting at a small round table by the window, paper cups of coffee untouched between them. They looked older than they were. Not aged by time, but by exposure. Like people who had been forced into light after living comfortably in shade. They didn't see me at first. I stood there for a moment, unnoticed, watching them sit in silence. No arguing. No strategizing. Just two people who no longer knew what to say now that there was no one left to blame. That's when I realized something quietly devastating. They weren't angry at me. They were empty. When my mother finally noticed me, her face changed in stages. Surprise. Fear. Then something close to shame, though she didn't fully recognize it. She stood up halfway, uncertain. Harper. I nodded once. Polite. Distant. Final. My father stayed seated. He looked at the table like it had personally betrayed him. We didn't think it would end like this, my mother said. I didn't ask what this meant. I didn't need clarification. It didn't end, I said calmly. It revealed. There was no argument. No denial. No dramatic apology. Just the sound of a spoon clinking against porcelain as someone nearby stirred sugar into coffee. My mother's voice broke slightly. You didn't have to take it this far. I looked at her, really looked at her, and understood something that would have shattered me years ago. They still believed I'd acted to them. I didn't take it anywhere, I said. I stepped out of the way. That was it. No speech. No forgiveness scene. No reunion fantasy. I walked out before they could say anything else, before they could reshape the moment into something safer for themselves. Outside, the air felt lighter than it had in years. Life didn't magically improve after that. There was no celebration. No montage of success. Just steadiness. Clean credit. Quiet mornings. A name that finally belonged to me again. Occasionally, a relative would reach out. Some apologized awkwardly. Some asked questions they didn't actually want answered. Some stayed silent. I didn't chase any of them. Because here's the truth no one teaches you early enough. Being erased hurts, but being used hurts longer. And the most powerful thing I ever did wasn't exposing them. It was choosing not to rebuild what only existed because I was willing to disappear inside it. Now, when I think back to that dinner, the folding chairs, the ripped photos, the trash can beside the table, it doesn't sting the way it used to. It feels small. Contained. Like something that ended exactly when it needed to. So here's what I want to know, honestly. When a family only values you as long as you're quiet, is walking away really losing them, or finally choosing yourself?